You are listening to Parliament Matters, a Hansard Society production supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Learn more at hansandsociety.org.uk/pm.
Hello and welcome to Parliament Matters, the new podcast from the Hansard Society about the institution at the heart of our democracy, Parliament itself. I'm Ruth Fox.
And I'm Mark Darcy. Every week we're going to be analysing what's going on behind the Gothic facade of Westminster.
We'll be explaining how the system works and hearing about the latest research on the workings of Parliament and politics.
And looking back at key moments of parliamentary history. In our first episode, we were taking a look at the King's Speech, the programme of new laws that will keep Parliament chewing productively away right up to the next general election. But that's not the only thing that goes on in Parliament. There's also plenty of action up on the committee corridor, where MPs scrutinise in detail the workings of different government departments and the unfolding of government policy. And Ruth, it's been all changed there.
Yes, so the reshuffle that Keir Starmer did for his front bench has resulted in 3 select committee chair changes. So we'll perhaps cover those in a minute. But first, the Defence Committee, we saw the Conservative chair of that committee has been ousted.
The former chair, Tobias Ellwood, was effectively given the push by his members. They lost confidence in him. He concluded it wasn't possible for him to continue in the chair of that committee. And that was really quite a startling example of someone losing control of their committee, and the first time that someone's actually been pushed out in these circumstances, Ruth.
Yeah, so Tobias went to Afghanistan and seemed to have made a statement indicating that he thought the security situation had improved under the Taliban. So you can imagine the reaction, well, of MPs generally, but particularly his committee members were pretty outraged. And it became clear when he got back that he'd lost the confidence of his colleagues. And, you know, once you're in that position as a committee chair, you've really no option but to go.
This wasn't a one-off incident. This was, if you like, the last straw. There have been several other incidences where he had said stuff with the authority of the committee chair, but without the authority of the actual committee, and he had upset his committee members one time too many, and that meant there was an organised attempt to remove him that didn't actually have to be pushed to a final vote.
Yeah, I mean, he'd clearly tested their patience beyond which they decided that was it. A line was drawn. So we've now got Robert Courts. He won the election to take over from Tobias as chair of the committee. And obviously, given the state of the world, the situation in Ukraine, situation in the Middle East, it's a really important committee and got some interesting inquiries coming up.
Yes, indeed. They've already, in fact, swung into action. The Defence Committee's had a hearing with generals from the Defence Staff talking about, amongst other things, the shortage of ammunition and their fears that the stockpiles aren't great enough if we actually got involved in a shooting war of some kind at the moment. And that's quite an alarming thing for the committee to hear. It's sort of building on the work the committee's been doing before. Under Tobias Ellwood, they produced a whole stream of reports about the state of our defences with titles like "We Need a Bigger Navy," which doesn't exactly bury the lead. So that's a campaign the committee's continuing on. And as you say, given the state of the world at the moment, it's a matter of concern that I imagine be attracting quite a lot of parliamentary attention.
Yeah, I mean, they had a big report in the summer about procurement. I mean, procurement across government is difficult and complex, and there's all sorts of issues with it, but particularly at the MOD, I mean, it's notorious. They've had lots of reviews, lots of committee inquiries over the years, but the committee produced a pretty damning report in the summer. And of course, one of the big issues that the committee's concerned about, and, you know, you see generals turning up to the committee and sort of talking about this, is we're giving a lot of kit, material, equipment to Ukraine. How quickly is that being replenished? And in the event that, you know, we were facing difficulties, would we have enough on the stocks to defend ourselves? And so, you know, in terms of the future, that's going to be quite critical.
And the other underlying concern here is, if you like, the pattern of some exciting new piece of defence kit is ordered. Years later, it's very late, it's wildly over budget, and it doesn't actually work yet. And there have been any number of weapons systems that have been ordered by the MOD that have fitted that description. I mean, the case of the Ajax armoured fighting vehicle, sort of infantry carrier, that at one point was so noisy that it posed a risk to the hearing of the crew inside it. It couldn't go very fast, had all sorts of other problems with it. Those are, we're told, being resolved now, but that's a not atypical example of what seems to happen rather too often. And people are looking to, why can other countries manage this? Israel was cited as a case in point, as a country with a much more efficient system of defence procurement than we have, that doesn't see these wild cost overruns.
Yeah, the other issue that the committee has started looking at is the accommodation for service personnel, which, I mean, I don't know much about it, but I certainly know some people who have been on some of the bases and say it's not the best condition. Now, they've got this sort of inquiry running, and one of the interesting things in the summer was that the committee was told by the MOD that service personnel couldn't submit evidence to it. Needless to say, the committee were not that impressed with that, because who better to tell them about the state of service accommodation than the inmates themselves, as it were. And they've now rowed back on that, the MOD. The Defence Secretary said, no, OK, we've heard what the committee's got to say about this. OK, fine, the service personnel can submit written evidence. There's certain conditions attached to that. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of evidence they get.
Well, you can understand why they might have chain of command worries about that sort of thing. No armed forces anywhere, I think, would be keen on their personnel going over their heads to elected politicians. But I think in this case, as you say, it's not as if they're questioning tactical decisions or something. I'll be watching with some interest myself because I spent a large chunk of my early life in RAF married quarters in all sorts of places across the world. So don't remember them being exactly palatial then, so heaven only knows what they're like now.
We will see.
Now, the next committee that we want to talk about, there are in fact 3 committees other than Defence that have also changed hands, but in slightly different circumstances. In each case, the existing chair has been sort of called to glory by Sir Keir Starmer, who has put the incumbent chairs on their front bench. The Business Committee is perhaps the most striking one, where the previous chair, Darren Jones, has been promoted straight into the Shadow Cabinet, where he'll be Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury after a pretty impressive stint chairing that committee. Now, this is the second Economic Committee, the big one. The Treasury Committee is in charge of sort of grand economic policy about interest rates and money supply and that kind of thing. The Business Committee is much more kind of granular, and will look at individual industries, what's going on in the steel industry, why did BHS collapse, that kind of thing. And it looks at them in some detail. And it's typically the one that the opposition gets while the government continues to hold on to the chair of the Treasury Committee. But it was a highly sought after post where Liam Byrne, the former Treasury Minister, just scraped in the election.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting because I thought Angela Eagle, who was the other candidate, might win that one. She lost by 2 votes. But I think it's an interesting one because there are some issues around sort of Liam's sort of political background. So, he's been sanctioned for, some issues around conduct in the Commons. So, that's a hot potato issue. And I thought MPs might not favour him as a result of that. Of course, he's also the author of that famous note that was left in the Treasury in 2010 after the 2010 election. There's no money left, which the Conservative Party chairman has been sort of merrily using 13 years later to remind everybody about the inheritance that the Conservative government got in 2010. I don't think it's getting much traction 13 years on. But
his Labour colleagues have finally forgiven him for it. Anyway.
Yeah, so I was surprised. And I said Angela lost by 2 votes, which I thought was interesting because there were 10 votes that were found to be invalid in that election, which begs the question, what were MPs doing?
Were they trying to write in an alternative candidate?
I don't know.
But you think, the pretty core skill amongst MPs is casting your vote. So for 10 of them to get it wrong suggests that something was afoot.
Or they weren't happy with either candidate and decided to try and put somebody else's name on the ballot. But anyway, Angela lost by 2 votes on that one. So watch this space, see what Liam does with the committee.
And ditto the Petitions Committee, where Catherine McKinnell's also been called on to the Labour front bench to be succeeded by another Labour MP, Cat Smith. And incidentally, remember with this, the committees are kind of divvied up between the parties. So Labour has the chair of certain committees, the Conservatives have the chair of some of the others, the SNP gets a couple as well. But Cat Smith was the Labour MP who won that election. And Petitions is kind of the new kid on the committee corridor. It's set up to kind of oversee the working of the e-petitioning system, where you can go online, you can petition Parliament over something. Sometimes it's someone should be sacked or some change to the law should be made or whatever it is. And if you get 100,000 signatures on that e-petition, it automatically gets a debate. And these debates are actually a much bigger deal than perhaps a lot of the inmates of Westminster realise.
Yeah, I mean, you'll know from your time at the BBC, short of Prime Minister's questions, they're the sort of most watched element of parliamentary activity in the Commons chamber. and signing a petition, the most popular form of political participation after voting. So very popular. If you're an MP and you're sort of wanting to capture an audience, or you've got some issues of campaigning interest, linking in with an e-petition campaign is a great way to get some profile.
I'm always surprised by how few MPs have actually cottoned on to this point, that this is somewhere where the public are genuinely watching, not least because a lot of these petitions are driven by hashtag social media campaigns. And if you are signing up to that, you can get an email saying this is going to be debated at such and such a time, tune in. And a surprising number of people do.
They're not sort of, massive policy changes that are happening with, huge social and economic implications. But if you've got a niche policy issue that might not require legislation to fix it, then being able to get a minister to a debate, having to answer questions, getting it on their radar, demonstrating that there's a campaign behind it can sometimes bring about some useful change.
And indeed, that point about getting it on a minister's radar and the minister seeing that there are people, both parliamentary colleagues and in the wider public concerned about an issue can sometimes sort of cattle prod them into action on something, and you suddenly find that there's a clause in a forthcoming bill that addresses that issue, whatever it is. So it is a useful way of bringing a bit of real-life non-SW1 experience into the wacky world of Parliament.
Yeah. So with that, should we turn to Standards Committee?
Ah, yes, the Standards Committee, the MP's ethics watchdog, the committee that deals with detailed complaints about an MP's behaviour, whether it's a sort of violation of parliamentary ethics or whatever it is, really. And that was chaired by Chris Bryant, the long-serving Labour MP, who again has been called up onto Sir Keir Starmer's front bench. And he's succeeded by one of Labour's real veterans, Harriet Harman, the former deputy leader of the Labour Party, has taken over this job. Incidentally, this is a post that has to be held by a member of the opposition. The Standards Committee, by long-standing convention, can't be an instrument of government to be turned against opposition MPs when they get inconvenienced. So it's always chaired by an opposition MP. Harriet Harman, of course, was very prominently the MP who presided over the inquiry into Boris Johnson. Now, this was not actually quite by the Standards Committee. This is by a kind of offshoot committee of the Standards Committee called the Privileges Committee, which investigates kind of affronts to the Commons. Like, for example, did Boris Johnson mislead MPs over those COVID-era parties in Downing Street? So Harriet Harman presided over those. She's now taking over for real across the whole committee. And again, it's one of these moments where you're at the fag end of a parliament and it's not clear that she'll have much chance to make any real impact before the election's called and the music stops.
Yeah, and the issue with this committee, of course, is that to a certain extent it is reactive rather than proactive, because it has to deal with the reports that come from the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, cases, whether it's bullying, harassment, whatever it is, that the Commissioner's investigated. She will have to continue to sort of, her committee members will have to sort of continue to look at those cases as and when the flow of reports comes through. But they have started an inquiry on a sort of more strategic basis, looking at the regulatory landscape, if you like, of standards for MPs. There's a sort of an alphabet soup of bodies and processes that regulate MPs now in terms of their conduct. And the feeling is that this has gotten potentially a bit too complicated, and that they need to have a sort of a bit of a rethink and simplify it.
Yeah, there's been a thing for a while now where every time there's a sort of exciting new species of complaints against MPs has evolved, the Commons has come up with a new body to deal with it. So when you had the expenses scandal, which is a disturbingly long time ago now, it's 15, 16 years, when the expenses scandal came along, they invented IPSA, the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, to police MPs' expenses and make sure the system wasn't being milked by unscrupulous honourable members. When there was a rash of complaints about bullying and harassment and even sexual abuse of Commons staff, they invented the Independent Complaints and Grievance Service, which was headed by an independent expert panel, so that MPs themselves were not adjudicating on complaints that came from MP staff, so some sort of collective solidarity of MPs wouldn't undermine the complaints process there. So, as you say, more and more of these bodies appear every time there's something there, and there's a certain feeling that there's too many different processes and it all gets rather confusing and messy.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is if they can report, obviously a lot depends on the timing of the general election, but if they can do the inquiry and report before the election, and sort of, they can set out an agenda that they might not be able to get it in place before the general election takes place, but if they can sort of set that out in their report, they can sort of hand it over as a sort of legacy report to the next Parliament with a view to implementing it and providing a sort of a new foundation for the regulation in the future. Nobody's, I think, suggesting that there'll be significant changes to the requirements on MPs, but just that sort of the reporting structure and the relationships between those bodies can be improved.
And on the principle of strike while the iron is hot, a Commons full of wide-eyed, innocent, idealistic members of Parliament is perhaps more ready to pass this kind of thing into the rules than a sort of hard-eyed, cynical, been there, done it all, experienced House of Commons later on. So maybe the moment just after an election is the moment when you can get this stuff through.
Yeah, and one of the issues that they're going to have to consider in this inquiry is what do they do with the Recall Act? Do they want to reform that? And I think that's sort of topical at the moment because, of course, Peter Bone, the Conservative MP for Wellingborough, is being recalled. I mean, the recall petition has now started in his constituency, and the Standards Committee is sort of, that's part of its regulatory sort of landscape inquiry. Are there changes that we need to make to that?
Just to explain that point a little bit, in the coalition era, they set up this system where if an MP was suspended for more than 10 sitting days of Parliament, that triggered a process where their constituents could in effect feel their collar, and if 10% of their voters in their constituency voted to recall the MP, then a by-election was held. That MP was effectively unseated. That the MP could perhaps run in that by-election if they could get the backing to do so from their constituency association or enough people to nominate them and run as an independent, whatever. But the MP loses their seat and may or may not then recontest it. And that's a system that's been used a number of times, frequently to some effect, although at least one MP has survived the process.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the first time the recall petition was run, so North Antrim, the DUP MP in Paisley, survived. But we've had recalls that have succeeded in Peterborough, Brecon and Radnorshire, and of course most recently in Scotland in the seats. Rutherglen and Hamilton, I think. Margaret Ferrier, of course, who got done under the COVID regulations, and she was recalled earlier this summer. So Peter Bone sanctioned for 6 weeks. The independent expert panel found that his appeal against the sanctions are, in terms of bullying and harassment that he was found guilty of, they rejected his appeal. They said no, the 6-week suspension was appropriate. That's obviously engages the terms of the Recall Act. So that recall petition is now open to the constituents in Wellingborough.
And recall has become quite a big deal in terms of the number of by-elections it's causing now. You know, the Grim Reaper has been somewhat eclipsed by the sort of disciplinary process where people are either recalled or perhaps resign their seats in anticipation that they might be recalled. So it's suddenly changing things. And the government's majority has actually come down quite sharply as a result of a series of by-elections of one sort or another over this time. And I don't know if the people who were writing the Recall Act back in the coalition years quite anticipated how deeply it might bite.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, there's only been 3 MPs so far that have been recalled, so we might have 4 if the Wellingborough constituency supports it. But there are MPs who would rather not go through that process and resign before it. So you can see how the embarrassment, the scale of sanctions now that apply is forcing some resignations. It will be interesting to see. There are 30 MPs in this Parliament who have lost the whip, which is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, and indeed, and that includes in their number, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, Nick Brown, the former Labour chief whip. These are not necessarily, incidentally, anyone who's an independent is not necessarily for, if you like, ethics reasons. In a number of cases, it's political differences. They've had some kind of falling out with their party leadership, and that has precipitated it. So, for example, Angus Brendan McNeill, the SNP MP, has had a big falling out with the SNP leadership and decided to move away from the SNP whip. He hasn't actually joined the Albert Party, which does have a parliamentary presence of 2 SNP defectors, but he's sort of sitting away now from the main block of SNP people, which is quite startling given that he was one of the handful of SNP MPs who had seats in Parliament before their big landslide in 2015.
Yeah. And of course, Andy MacDonald is one of the most recent ones, the Labour MP who's lost the whip while they investigate his comments on Gaza. And of course, Matt Hancock, he'll be sort of up in front of the COVID inquiry, but he lost the whip for going on, I'm a celebrity. So there are lots of different reasons why people have lost the whip. And of course, some get the whip back. But at the moment, there's sort of 18, I think, MPs now are sitting as independents, which makes them the third party because they're bigger than the Lib Dems.
And some of those MPs are there because there have been allegations made against them that are in the process of being investigated. But again, we hit one of the big sort of messy factors that is why the Standards Committee is taking such a big look at this whole issue, which is that MPs can be left in limbo for a disturbingly long time while stuff is going on. And it may be that it's not just sort of one process, it's not even double jeopardy, sometimes it's triple jeopardy. Sometimes there's a party investigation, a parliamentary investigation and a police investigation into the same set of allegations, and everybody's waiting on those processes to unfold, and it can take a very long time to clear the decks. And in the meantime, you may have a situation where an MP has agreed not to come into Parliament because of safeguarding concerns that they're accused of sexual harassment or some offence or a violent offence or something like that, and they don't want staff to be exposed to risk by their presence.
No, well, to go back to your point about these being issues of long standing, I mean, that's the context of the Peter Bone case. The allegations about him date back 10 years, and one of the issues is that complainant went first to the Conservative Party to complain about it, and somehow that did not get resolved. It sort of got kicked into the long grass. The complainant then went through the parliamentary process. That stalled because they were waiting for the party to resolve it, and now the complainant got fed up, I think, of waiting, withdrew his complaint from the party, and then the parliamentary process took its course, and we are now in a situation where we'll have to see what happens in his constituency. But yeah, one of the issues, and it's a really difficult one because I don't want to imply at all that I think the bar on standards for MPs should be lowered. I absolutely don't. But we have to deal with also the other side of the discussion, which is we're facing a situation where MPs who have been elected are not coming on to the parliamentary estate, quite rightly, I think, because the trade unions and staff and so on have real concerns about some incredibly serious allegations that have been made against them. We don't know much detail. There are a number of cases where MPs, the complaints are obviously with the party, not the parliamentary process. We don't know anything about what's happening with those. So MPs are not performing their parliamentary duties because they're not coming on to the parliamentary estate. Their constituents
can't be properly represented.
Yeah, so there's a democratic deficit for their constituents. And the problem here is, how do you balance the needs of the constituency, the constituents to be represented properly? At the moment, those MPs effectively are able to operate as a sort of like a glorified postman for them, but they can't go on and into the estate and ask questions. They can't participate in debates. So there's a problem there. But equally, if there are really serious allegations, as there seem to be against these MPs, then you can understand completely the concerns of the staff and the trade unions that they shouldn't be let loose on the estate until matters are resolved.
The scenario is, what if you find yourself in a Commons lift with someone you've accused of sexual harassment?
That's clearly what's happening over the years.
I mean, the most spectacular example and very current example is some of the allegations that have emerged in the new book by Nadine Dorries about the removal of Boris Johnson. She's talking about an MP who basically is being described, an unnamed MP I should say, who's basically been described as a serial rapist. And there's been huge concern about who that might be and what the risk might be to people in the parliamentary estate. And the prospect, one of the unions involved in the Palace of Westminster and the First Division Association have written to the parliamentary authorities about that, wanting to get some kind of reassurance.
Yeah, I mean, their latest letter is direct to the Prime Minister saying, there's a real problem here when the complaints are made to the parties. How seriously do they take it? What steps do they take? Do they report it to the police? I mean, the allegation is that the party didn't report it to the police initially, and the party chairman found out about it when a new chairman was appointed, and he reported it to the police, but it appeared to have been sort of sat on previously. So, some really, really difficult issues. And The Commons Commission, which is sort of the top management group, the Speaker and sort of the the leader of the House of Commons, shadow leader of the Commons, and so on, have been looking at this. On what basis can you exclude MPs from the parliamentary estate? Because of course there's a constitutional right that an MP cannot be impeded from doing their duties as a parliamentarian at Westminster, and that dates back to sort of the Bill of Rights. But on the other hand, there is this issue about if a member has been arrested, perhaps not charged yet, may indeed be found not guilty, may not ever be charged, but if they're arrested and there are serious allegations, should at that point the MP be excluded from the estate? Or do the principles of natural justice say no, they should only be excluded from the estate if they're charged?
There is no right answer to this one, as far as I can see. There's a very difficult balancing act, and at the moment it's resolved by the Speaker asking an MP to agree not to come in, and presumably if they did come in defiance of that, the Speaker just wouldn't call them to speak. It's an unsatisfactory situation, and as you say, the constitutional issues are very high-powered. I mean, I've never thought it should be easy to remove elected MPs, because if it's easy to remove them, sooner or later the process gets weaponised against someone who's just plain inconvenient to a government or inconvenient to their party. And then we're off to the races with people being sort of knocked off by spurious complaints which keep them out of parliamentary circulation. And it never ends.
Yeah. I mean, we've heard, tales of various MPs themselves describing this as, the sort of the worst parliament ever. And this issue about the level of misbehaviour, the number of MPs that have lost the whip, the number of MPs that have had to resign because of misconduct.
But the other point I think that really has to be underlined is that the system is exposing these cases in a way that may not have happened before. That's not to say that everybody who's done anything bad is getting their collar felt by the parliamentary authorities, but the system is bringing more people out there. And I think in previous eras, people might have been quietly allowed to slink away, or might even just have had their behaviour tolerated as, well, boys will be boys.
Yeah. And I think that the big test is for the political parties at this coming election, because, they've known the election is coming. This is not a snap election like 2017 and 2019. The selection processes have been in train for a while. It's incumbent upon them to be doing the screening at the selection process level, to be doing the due diligence to ensure that if there are any suspicions of candidates, in terms of misbehaviour, in terms of their ethics and so on, that they're weeded out. Now, you don't want that to tip over into scenarios where, you get identikit politicians. That's not what we're talking about. But some politicians who got through at recent previous elections, I think got through because the screening wasn't in place and people thought that they wouldn't win those seats. And next time, the true test, I think, of these new systems that are in place is whether in the next Parliament we actually, having dealt with a lot of these legacy cases, in the next Parliament, we don't have this situation where you've got 30 MPs losing the whip.
Well, you've got to have a situation where the parties look at individuals and not just at their own party credentials and whether they're long-serving councillors or whatever, but also look at their behaviour patterns, look at what they've got to contribute. It's about calibre and it's about ethics. And it's really a responsibility. If you're selecting someone who you think might get into Parliament or even has an outside chance of getting into Parliament, make sure they're not a wrong 'un.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to return to this theme quite a few times before the election.
You bet.
Okay, so that's all from us for this episode of Parliament Matters. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you get the next episode. Do share your thoughts by reviewing us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you've got any questions you'd like us to talk about in our special Urgent Questions episodes, go to hansardsociety.org.uk/PM. You can put your questions there.
Or you can follow us across social media at Hansard Society. Thanks for joining us. See you soon.
Goodbye.
Parliament Matters is produced by the Hansard Society and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. For more information, visit hansardsociety.org.uk/PM or find us on social media at Hansard Society.